Hello, everyone. This is a panel discussion for the May 2025 TOK questions. And we're joined here, let me go around the table and have people introduce themselves. Well, I'm John Rees. I'm a teacher of English within the arts.
I'm Mr. Hall. I teach humanities, history and psychology and TOK.
I'm Mr. Lam and I am the math teacher here at ICHK.
I'm Mr. Buiz. I teach English and TOK.
All right, so we are joined by a mathematician, and one of the things, our year 13s are listening in now, watching this conversation, and we have had a couple of lessons to break apart the titles, but really pleased that Jimmy Lamb can join us because he's a mathematician and George Box is a statistician. So we want to start with number 5. To what extent do you agree with the claim that all models are wrong, but some are useful? Discussed with reference to mathematics. So just to generally open this up, it seems like a paradoxical statement. Why would we bother with models if they're all wrong anyway? So it's quite a playful, provocative statement from George Box. I might think that maybe you could think of a map as a model. It's a globe is a model, I guess a three-dimensional structure, but maybe on a two-dimensional plane we might look at maps as metaphors, and they are necessarily reducing down and simplifying meaning. The only way you could get a perfectly accurate depiction of the globe is if you had another globe, another planet Earth. Maybe we could look at models within the human sciences, within economics, where models for supply and demand and social patterns of behavior and prediction patterns are often used. And we'll hear from Mr. Hall in history, and I'll have a think in English and the arts how that's the case. But Jimmy, could you open us up, please, with think about mathematical models? What's George Box getting at with that statement?
Right, in math, when we talk about in math, when we talk about modeling, we usually use functions to model. And what the model that we usually use in math is to help us make predictions using data that we collected in the past, and then based on the data that we collected, we create a model using a function, and then we usually use it to graph things, to make a function to predict things. And to a certain extent, I would agree to this statement that all models are wrong, but some are useful. The reason being is that, like I said before, when we look at functions in math, we usually collect data that we had in the past. And what happened is that what happened in the past might or might not repeat itself. And if we're making the assumption that history will repeat itself, then yes, this will be a good model. But the situation that we're in right now is that things are constantly changing, things are constantly, things are dynamic, so things are constantly changing. So unless history repeats itself, then the model that we create might not be useful, or it might be wrong in some instances. And an example that I could give is people often use models to predict the stock market, to predict the economy, and sometimes they're right, sometimes they're wrong, and some people predict that there will be a recession in 2024 based on their model and based on what they have seen in the past, based on trends that they have seen. But again, living in 2024 right now, we just survived COVID and other things that the model might not be able to factor in. So I would say the models itself, again, if history does repeat itself, then yes, the model would be useful. But in a very, very complex situation where things are constantly changing, things are constantly moving, then the model that we create might not be useful. But after why do we even look at these mathematical models after all? Because I would say these models would still give us a sense and an idea of what might happen in the future. Whether they do happen or not, I think it is not certain that these things will happen.
So I've got a question. Then. So apart from applied mathematical functions used to predict things like stock market, population growth, decline, spread of disease, all those kind of things where you see mathematics applied in things like the human sciences and the natural sciences. I mean, COVID epidemiology, that relied on mathematical modelling. is there something within pure mathematics that you would describe as a model in pure maths that's only used in mathematics for mathematics only? And in that case, is mathematics models, are they not wrong, they're in fact correct, if it's used solely within mathematics? Can you think of an example where that would be the case? I can't.
If you look at trends, if you look at things that have a cycle, so for example, if you look at things that are seasonal, then there are trends. If I look at ice cream sales, usually there are sales in ice cream sales usually peak up during the summertime. So when there are trends, when things are seasonal, then there seems to be a bit of patterns. But then with things like the economy, with the stock market, things are very, very dynamic, and there are so many factors that we have to consider as well. And I would say the mathematical model itself might not purely reflect what is happening in the real world.
Thanks, Jimmy. Can I ask you, is an equation a model? I asked another TOK teacher in Hong Kong this, and he said, well, it's not a model, it's a perspective. An equation, like in Euclidean geometry, is a perspective, and in fact, because it's the equal sign, an equation is two perspectives. And, well, he completely lost me with that. So is an equation a model? Can we use that as part of the supporting evidence for this?
And the equation, in a sense, I would say is a simplified model of a situation. So, for example, we have an equation for the area of a circle, area of any geometry shapes, right? Geometrical shapes. But I would say that model is usually an equation is a simplified version of things that are quite static.
And so a circle, the equation, is it pi r squared?
The area of a circle is pi r squared, correct.
But does that equation describe the model of a circle? Do you see what I'm getting at? Because if that's the case with pure mathematics, then that's always true. If mathematics just exists in the pure abstract realm, when you try to translate that, an engineering problem could be trying to create a perfect circle, and albeit technology with laser cutting precision is catching up to maybe at one point make this abstract pure conception real, probably at the moment it's not. That's probably something that the engineers on Tesla, the Cybertruck, it looks like it's geometrically perfectly flat, but it isn't actually, because when they moved those planes into the real world, they found that it was very, very difficult to create a straight-edged car. Like just the panels, the production method means that's problematic. James May, who used to be on Top Gear, has got a really nice piece reviewing the Cybertruck. That's where I got that idea from. So yeah, pure mathematics, models, Euclidean geometry, they're always correct, aren't they?
Now again, we live in a 3D world, right? So what happened is that if you look at Euclidean geometry, those are based on two-dimensional. Of course, in real life, even if you go on a plane, right? If you look at how the plane travels, it doesn't travel in a straight line. It travels on a curve. So again, in an ideal situation where things are two-dimensional, then these sort of models would work. But because, again, like I said, because we live in a complex world, and there are so many different factors, like, with these model, in an ideal situation, yes, it will work, but because there are so many different factors that come into play, which will affect the model, like you said, like you mentioned about the Cybertruck as well.
And I'd like to invite Mr. Du Bois in. Can I just have one last point, though, Jimmy? So I was thinking about, what was I thinking about? Actually, no, could you step in?
So it seems to me like this question, we have to identify some of the terms. Like, what is a model exactly? It's going to be very difficult to answer if we don't know what that is. And so I just said a model is a simplified representation of reality that we can kind of follow and use for prediction. I don't know that much about math, but I think Mr. Lam is saying that like as math becomes more abstract, the predictive quality increases. And as it becomes more real, it decreases. And so the model's perfect in a high level of abstraction. Of course, like for us, social science, so what does it mean all models are wrong? Does that mean they're not perfect? Because no social science is perfect. We cannot accurately predict human nature or human behavior. Stock market, as Mr. Lam said. Like, they're all like very general, basic, it's a framework, but it's not going to be applied perfectly anywhere. I think this is what Mr. Box is saying as a statistician, but I'm not familiar with his work.
I googled him. I think he's operating in like the middle part of the 20th century. So you defined models as simplified models of reality, and so I wondered then, could George Box have ever conceived of second-generation AI and these incredibly complex, not two-dimensional anymore, but three-dimensional computational programs that are able to run things like how did the universe begin? Is the computing power there yet, Jimmy, or does that statement still ring true?
I was thinking with AI, with technologies right now, if we were to create a model, I would say it will do a pretty good job trying to model the current situation. But if we use it to predict the future, let's say in 10 years' time, because situations will change in 10 years' time, that model might not be a good model. So yes, with technology, with AI, we're able to model the current situation, but because we're in the moment already, do we actually want to use a model to model the current situation?
Well, yeah, I think a good example would probably be typhoon prediction in Hong Kong, isn't it? We can model 100% accurately where the typhoon currently is, and that's not really a model, it's just a picture or a graph or a graphic showing those kind of things. But as soon as you try and apply a model based on weather patterns and pressure and heat and moisture, it becomes less and less defined. And you can see that in the typhoon tracks. As it goes further into the future, the track becomes wider and wider and wider and wider, and it becomes less predictable. I think the problem even with AI and being able to predict into the future using AI falls foul of the same problems, is you cannot map how every single molecule and every single part of that system is going to operate when it's far too complex. You can't predict that into the future. Anybody that says they can is either lying or trying to sell you something.
Just for AI, a lot of people think that AI is actually creating knowledge. It's not creating anything. It's just finding things. So if you type something, it's not creating an answer. It's just scouring the web for the consensus answer, like the most popular answer. So let's not think that AI is like creating new knowledge or information. It really isn't. It's creating, AI is like second generation. It's creating new ways of finding this information, but it's not creating knowledge at all.
It's aggregating stuff.
Yeah, absolutely.
So yeah, I think we've talked about things like the irrationality of human beings. That's something you would explore, I think, with economics. There's an interesting guy called Rory Sutherland who's he's on YouTube and has TED Talks about the power of marketing. So the supply and demand graphs, there's this sort of useful model that has a facade of scientific validity because it uses mathematics to create these graphs, so we might defer to it as being true. Yes, the idea that Rory Sutherland talks about is Coca-Cola. It's got a price point. It's delicious. It's hugely popular. How would you counter that? Well, the supply and demand graph would say, well, you need to create something that's going to be cheaper and more sugary and more delicious, and then you might be able to create huge profits. But he talks about, paradoxically, because we are irrational, Red Bull tastes disgusting and also is priced really highly and has become that becomes seductive and attractive. It's reassuringly expensive. So yeah, we human beings, we're irrational and unpredictable. You could explore that more. I think it's really beholden upon you IB students to go and take these ideas, take these questions and ask your IB subject specialists. From an arts perspective, it got me thinking about realism. Models like stagecraft, you might think about realism. Henrik Ibsen is a playwright that I think all of our Year 13s are studying. Or realism when you're doing a still life depiction, like it looks like it almost looks like the character can follow you around the gallery with their eyes. There's something about that which is obviously, it's a simplification again, but there's something where we can, what is it, you suppress your disbelief.
Willing suspension of disbelief.
A willing suspension of disbelief. So it allows you, whether that's a performance, a musical performance, or a stage performance, there's something happening there which we know isn't actually real, but is allowing us to get into the realm of the emotional, our family relationships, our social relationships, something about the human experience that we can see, something of our lives, the human condition reflected back to us upon stage. And some of the styles and genres of stagecraft could be like a late Victorian era Norwegian higher middle class aristocratic audience looking into this world of Tora and what's his name, Torvald and Nora, and the stage curtains go back and you're effectively looking back into your own living room. But then there are other like Eisenstein in cinema, or who might we have, Samuel Beckett, where the stages are intended to be much more abstract and conceptual. So that's somewhere where I might apply that title to the arts.
I was thinking from a, excuse me, from a history perspective, there are models and historical schools, such as a communist historical school, a Whig historical school, a Nales historical school. They seek to identify the underlying causes of things and then use those to model what will happen elsewhere, or to explain and then to model. So Whig historians, for example, saw everything as a slow progression towards a liberal democracy and the height of development. The end result was liberal democracy, and that was going to progress through history, through time, and those states that were further along would reach the hallowed, the sunlit uplands of liberal democracy, and some were slightly further behind, and they would go through those stages. It was a peak and trough, peak and trough. Communism is as a historical theory, is really about predicting the future. You look at the past, you look at the models of what had happened in these states, in these countries, and then they would be a progress towards communism at the end. We know from experience that this isn't the case, this doesn't happen. Doesn't mean it won't in the future, but as a model of historical development, it doesn't hold, it doesn't hold up. And that's the thing with models in history, is that there are too many unpredictable elements, there is too much incomplete evidence, there is too much scope for interpretation, and there is also this idea that history the theme repeats, the melody repeats, but not the lyrics or something like that. It was a very good quote around that aspect. But also, even when we've tried to use mathematical big numbers to try and use it as a predictive model, so there was a group of mathematicians that tried to collate or produce big numbers or use big number theory to predict the future. That still didn't work because it's too unpredictable.
Can I just add one more thing as well? I just remember last year we brought some year 12 students to Central to model the Ferris wheel. Right, so there was one time we brought the year 12 students to the Ferris wheel to model the height of the Ferris wheel. We were able to get the equation of the Ferris wheel, but then when the Ferris wheel went around one more time, our model was wrong. And part of the reason was because, there were people lining up to get on the Ferris wheel. Maybe perhaps when we first modeled the Ferris wheel, there were less people. But then as we waited, there were more and more people trying to get on. More and more people went on the Ferris wheel. So that took a bit more time for people to board the Ferris wheel. So even though we were able to fairly model the height of the Ferris wheel, but even as simple as modeling the height of the Ferris wheel, we weren't able to get the perfect model to model the height of the Ferris wheel.
Well, I was just thinking, like in literature class, we're kind of anti-model. We're saying, if there's a formula of a pattern, a bad writer will follow the formula. But On the other hand, like, they're useful. So, for example, Joseph Campbell in the 70s came up with this idea of the monomyth. Like, all mythology, almost all of it, follows the same structure. And we can use that model, and that's just how we create narratives. That's how we tell stories. So, is it perfect? No. No story will follow it exactly. But is it useful? Absolutely, yes, it is.
Great. Last thing I recommend people might watch for economics, showing how models can often be wrong, the collapse of the housing market, the mortgage market in 2008. There's a scene from The Big Short featuring Steve Carell, and he actually uses a model of a Jenga to model the fact that all of these A-grade stocks were being infiltrated with subprime C-grade dog mess stocks, and then of course that creates structural weaknesses and the whole thing collapses down. It's not actually how we would use a model in economics, but it goes to show us how models can be useful depending upon the audience to translate complex ideas in a simple and effective way. Someone who's very good at doing that is Miss Lai. Our scientist specialist has just arrived, so we'll wrap up that conversation now and get ready for the next question. All right, we're going to look at question number 4 now. Do the ever-improving tools of an area of knowledge always result in improved knowledge? And for this question, we've been joined by our science specialist, Miss Lai. So, Miss Lai, would you like to start breaking open this question from a science perspective? It would seem to be that ever-improving tools do lead to improved knowledge.
Certainly. I mean, from a science perspective, there is a lot I think we can talk about here in support, actually, of that, the fact that improving tools could lead to improved knowledge. Okay, so the obvious example there I would use, so I'm a biologist by training, so work on things like gene sequencing, and gene technology is something that is a pretty obvious example there, where there is constantly new knowledge coming about from research and improved technology in gene sequencing, for example. So when gene sequencing first started, it's called the Sanger sequencing method, and that used to be a pretty laborious and high-cost process. And it took a long time to process and so on. So the technology has improved so much that it's now actually quite easy to sequence a genome of an organism of choice, okay? So with that came quite a lot of improved knowledge in many different areas. A very famous example would be the BRCA1 gene, so the gene that is involved in we think increased risks of breast cancer, okay? And there is a particular sequence that is identified as being higher risk in terms of developing breast cancer. Obviously, there's more to it, but I don't have time to go into the sort of scientific details there. But the point is, with that new knowledge, we have been able to actually do quite a lot of preventative work around it. So you may know some famous celebrities who had some gene sequencing work done for themselves, and as a result of that, for example, went ahead and had a double mastectomy prior to even being diagnosed with breast cancer. So they didn't have breast cancer, okay? So they were not diagnosed with breast cancer, but then because of the existence of this gene, they went ahead and had a double mastectomy as a result, okay? However, with all of this, I think, comes some ethical and other concerns as well. You know, people argue that with the knowledge that we now have about genes and gene sequencing and so on, the anxiety level in the general population has increased, because, you know, you can now, some of you must know this or may have done this, you can now swab yourself in terms of your saliva to send a sample to get it sequenced to check for certain, for example, your DNA traits in terms of your heritage and so on, and you can pay for that service now. But then also people become more fearful about what they might be predisposed to, what kind of diseases they might or might not get in the future. And so that's, I think, one of the downsides of this improved technology. The other thing I would also think about with this question here is how does one define improved knowledge? What is the improved aspect of improved knowledge here? We don't tend to know that we are wrong until new evidence comes in science to prove us wrong. So yes, on the surface, in the scientific world, a lot of what we do in science leads to improved knowledge, but that improved knowledge isn't necessarily the whole picture, okay? That improved knowledge has room for improvement in itself, and could be proven wrong if more technology appears or that more evidence appears from the technology that we have, okay? So that's something that we need to think about as well. An example there would be the existence of quarks in physics. So initially, we thought that atoms only had those 3 subatomic particles, protons, neutrons, and electrons. But then, as more evidence came in, we now know that actually these protons and neutrons in particular are made of up quarks and down quarks. Physicists in the room can add to this. That's kind of the extent to which I know about this field. But then obviously there was quantum physics, there was relativity. All of these areas of physics in particular actually there's still a lot of questions unanswered. So I have no doubt that actually tools that are improving that we have in the scientific world may lead to improved knowledge there as well, okay? There's a little saying that I remind myself of as a science teacher, as a scientist, is that in science, I think that the more we know, the less we actually know. Because the more we know, the more questions we will have in our heads that we want to ask and answered. Yeah? Sorry, I sort of went on for quite some time.
Not at all.
Yes.
I was going to say that this idea of improved knowledge as well, the idea that as our tools improve, we can get more and more knowledge about a particular aspect. So our ability to specialize in a particular field increases, so you become ever more specialized, ever more finer line of your area that you know about. So coming from a physicist right down to a specific quantum subatomic particle physicist, and finer lines. So that produces more complexity, it produces more knowledge. It might not be improved, it just might be refined. But that also has quite negative connotations because people become, like the general lay population, maybe don't understand that or find it very hard to comprehend what's being talked about. So that leads to a lot of distrust among experts, even with things like how vaccines work. People distrust the specialists, they distrust the experts because it's difficult to understand. And therefore you get, as a result of this, a rise in anti-experts or people that are questioning the science and trying to be mavericks by challenging a perceived wisdom without any kind of expertise. And I think that plays on this idea that keyword always, not necessarily improving, maybe just deepening, and actually maybe having some very harmful, negative, anti-knowledge consequences.
And I would also add to that to say that actually in science, more often than you might think actually, we face what we call contradicting scientific evidence, okay? So something might come up in research that actually seems to go against what we already know of a particular concept. The classic example I would use there is knowledge around diets. So you must have heard about all of these different diets that people go on in order, for example, to lose weight, ketone diet, and intermittent fasting, and all of that. And the scientific evidence actually behind these diets are somewhat contradicting. It depends on what kinds of papers you look at. It depends on how the research was done and so on. And it's partly why there are still so many diets out there that people go with and try, because there is no general one consensus as to what one works best in terms of serving that purpose. Yeah.
So as an English teacher, of course, I'm going to parse the question first. And yes, always is always a red flag. But I had questions about improved knowledge too. It's like, does it mean improved on the individual level or on the collective level? Because on the individual level, we know that better tools they don't lead to improved knowledge. Think about Google Maps. Like when I was a kid, we had to, like on a paper map, we'd have to plot out exactly how long we would go. My son can't do any of that. He's like, just type it in. And a lot of knowledge was lost because of this improved tool, and I think that will happen a lot on the individual level. On the collective level, maybe not. Maybe as a society, it does always result in improved knowledge. Not sure, though.
Yeah, I think in technological revolutions, I think it was Plato who despaired about the invention of the pen, because then the cultural values were about being able to memorize and build soaring passages of rhetoric, or not soaring, maybe emotional, but also just really logical patterns of thought, so you could get to the axiomatic principles. And I think Plato's Academy, the Greek translation is something like, all you who enter here must know geometry. So there's some intrinsic knowledge which we maybe have. It's like when we've learned to write, we'll write things down there and we'll put it in the library, and we know we don't have to commit it to memory. I think that there's a lot you could say about AI and the danger of echo chambers, although we have in this task, we've been told explicitly to relate it to two areas of knowledge. To take your points further on from the arts, my neighbours are two literature professors. One of them is a poetry professor, and they both work at Hong Kong universities, and she uses Google Maps but as a prompt for poetry writing, because it's a means to explore other parts of the world and then to embrace this technological new paradigm and use it creatively. So I think there'll be many good examples of where technology can be used to augment artistic intentions, but then also there's this kind of, I think that we live in, this is a bit of a politicized statement, that we live in the cultural values of this globalized age are that of the capitalist economy and perpetual growth, and that science fits within this often to seek and explore, but also refine in a competitive sense, whether that's like national space programs or whatever. There's this competitive advantage with improving tools, and it might be the case that if tools are improved within the sciences, it depends perhaps to what aims those tools and technologies are being put towards. So if you've created a technology that can refine uranium more efficiently, or increase the volume of rainforest that you would cut down so that you are able to seek economic advantage of that, then that's potentially very dangerous. Speaking of those two literature professors, they won't go back straight away to teach in the States because there aren't any jobs for them. Increased knowledge and funding for the sciences and STEM means that there's a reduction of funding in the arts and history. So there's a real negative playing out there. But one more positive about how this new technology can help or augment the field of knowledge of literature. So my friend and neighbour upstairs was saying that his job is literary analysis, and what you do is you go into huge libraries, like there's a huge English literature library in Austin, Texas at the university there, and the individual goes through and they'll read a certain section of literary texts, and they will make some claims and assumptions then about what the cultural context was deemed important. So it might be that Harold Bloom, a literary critic, studies the poetry of the plays of Henrik Ibsen, and he makes the claim that, yes, a big obsession with the late Victorian audience was that they were concerned with manners and etiquette. That could be the case, but that's one critic, one expert, taking a very limited set of the vast repository of literary texts out there and making claims and inferences which may be invalid. So now the field of literary analysis, he says, will change seismically in the next 5-10 years as you're able to feed in all of the literary texts that were created, and from that use computing technologies to create patterns where you can make clearer inferences about what the truth might be.
Can I add to that as well? Because I think with technology, and I do agree that we're able to know a lot more with technology. So, for example, scientists, computer scientists, they're always trying to work out, thousands, millions of digits of pi, and they're still working to improve the number of digits they know about pi. So they're constantly trying to improve what they know about pi. So that is just an example where, with the advance of technologies, we're able to work out more digits of pi. We're able to work out more digits of the irrational number yi as well. And nowadays, there's photo math. There are different apps that people could use to search up the answers, and they're able to get these. I would say they're able to get facts a lot easier than what they used to. And the question that I have is, are these facts knowledge, or do they actually know what's going on? Because I think we have to be really, really careful here. Is that, yes, we're able to search up facts on the internet, but how much do we understand about what's going on behind these form, or behind the scene? So I think we have to be really, really careful about do we mean by improved knowledge, or do we mean by improving the facts that we know?
Just one thing from a sort of history perspective, but also focusing on this idea of what we mean by tools. We've talked about equipment, things, objects, AI, but you could also consider tools as being conceptual tools, ways of thinking, ways of interpretation from a conceptual perspective. So, LGBTQ plus rights, we could talk about history from that perspective. We can use that as a conceptual tool, and throughout the last 20th century, our understanding of LGBTQ plus rights has improved. We've become more aware of these people in history, or those different aspects of historical stories, historical narratives. So those improved conceptual tools have helped us view maybe our history in a slightly different way. There's a lot of authors, a lot of writers looking at queer history and talking about London, for example, from the perspective of a LGBTQ perspective. There is, however, obviously, with that improved conceptual tools, there is potential, I suppose, to see this more frequently in the past than it actually existed, and using these conceptual tools to apply ways of thinking and ways of being on the past that didn't really exist in that way, or at least don't have any significant meaning. The example of a Roman emperor whose name has totally forgotten, and he was referred to as she. He was described as dressing up in women's clothes, and this was seen as an example of trans rights in the Roman period. This emperor dressed like a girl, referred to himself as her, and all the reports we had would seem to support that. That's great. Look at this. They were much more aware of trans rights even in the past than we are today in some ways. Until it was pointed out that actually these reports were written by detractors of this particular emperor. They were critical of him, and the best way they could think of doing that was basically by calling him a girl. And that actually there wasn't much evidence to suggest that trans rights were a thing at the time, because people didn't really care that much about it. Men often had both male and female lovers, especially if you were rich, and that dressing up as a woman or dressing up as a male actually wasn't treated as a major thing. But it could be used as an insult, and it's a lack of, I think, a conceptual tool being applied blanketly across something without an awareness of the context in which it's being applied.
And I guess on a related note there, so in the scientific world, when we say sort of improved tools, we don't just mean the technology around science research, right? The classic moment there is obviously the development of the thinking around the scientific methods back in the scientific revolution, right? When people actually started to think of science very differently from the church having the say in pretty much everything at the time, to then people starting to question this notion of the Earth being in the center of the solar system, then moving on to the heliocentric idea, and then to the development of the telescope and so on. And from evidence, we now know that actually the system as a solar structure is one where the sun is the center of the solar system. And so even back then, the scientific revolution, I think, really speaks to this question that we have here.
Thank you.
So should we move on?
And now we move into our third question for today, and so we're looking at number 6. Does acquiring knowledge destroy our sense of wonder? I think we could remember that feeling of, I don't know, for me in Britain, like first seeing snow or something like that, that sense of wonder of seeing the scale of the cosmos depicted, or going to the history museum. There are moments as children where we have this sense of real wonder, and I think if we stayed, of course, in that childlike state, we weren't to realise that the Tooth Fairy and Santa Claus weren't actually convenient tricks and cultural ideas, that we would be rather ignorant, wouldn't we? So there's something, I think, necessary about shedding that skin and developing and inquiring that you learn more. And but it may be that at a certain stage, maybe you can become saturated, and you could become overwhelmed, perhaps, and jaundiced by all the truths being revealed. Who would like to open up on this one? Yeah.
We often see this as language teachers, the idea that analyzing something will destroy its beauty. So think back to your poetry lessons. I'm sure there was someone who said, like, why can't we just read the poem and enjoy the poem? Why do we have to look at the meter and all this? The idea is that if your knowledge will actually prevent you from enjoying something. So if you're looking at a beautiful landscape, if you start talking about it, somehow your enjoyment decreases. And like I said, this is like a bane in English class. I think in some cases we can say that's true. So if you have detailed knowledge about how hot dogs are made, you probably don't want to eat hot dogs very often. But on the other hand, my rebuttal would be that if you actually understand what people are doing and how things are created, I think your enjoyment will increase because you will see the craft. And otherwise, it's just a primal emotional response to it.
Sorry, Jim. So when I saw this question, what I thought of instantly was Richard Dawkins' book, and I've talked about this before. Richard Dawkins' book, Unweaving the Rainbow, and he wrote this as a response to criticism he'd had about his book, The Blind Watchmaker and the Selfish Gene, because he'd been criticised as people seeing this as too much of a reduction down to sort of just existence and there's no joy in life. So he wrote Unweaving the Rainbow as a response to those criticisms. And the book is basically saying, no, the more you know, the more you understand, the more wonder it creates, because it doesn't reduce things down to, well, he says, a deity is the answer to everything. No, it's much more complicated, it's much more complex, and as soon as you know more, you have more questions, as Ms. Lai said when we were talking about question 4. This idea that it opens up new avenues, it makes things seem much more amazing than they really are. When you know how a rainbow is formed from the title, it doesn't mean that a rainbow is any less beautiful, but understanding the science behind it and the refraction of light through a prism, in other words, water droplets, that's pretty amazing that actually happens, and that's a thing that you can see. And I think that when I read something about history and when I read more and more books, just because I've read a book about Nazi Germany or the origin of Indian culture or something truly I've just started reading lots of books on Persia. As soon as I start reading those, I don't go, oh, well, I've read one now, I'm done. No, it opens up new avenues, creates much more interest. And again, I think I said this to my class anyway, that when you know something, when, Richard Evans writes about Germany, writes about Nazi Germany in the 20th century, he talks about this and he was interviewed and he was saying, well, everybody's written books about this. You've spent your entire career writing about this, aren't you done? And he went, no, I've got this There is so much, left for us to understand. We've talked about Hitler, we've talked about his henchmen, we've talked about the impact on the economy, on this. And we now want to explore what everyday people felt about it because we want to understand how this came about, how it happened. So yes, we can understand more, and it doesn't mean that we've lost our wonder, whatever really a sense of wonder means anyway. We haven't lost it. If anything, we're creating new avenues for wonder.
Yeah, I will add to that as well, because in math, I think students often think about, they just want the formula, they just want the quick fix. And I think if we just focus on the formula, if we just focus on a bunch of rules, then, we are, removing these sort of curiosity. And a lot of times in math, there are a lot of, the formula, there's a reason behind the formula. There's a reason behind the first principle in calculus. All right, so these are things that's, I think we have to, wonder with the thing about, we are human beings. Isaac Newton was the one who discovered the first principle. When you know the theory behind, what Newton did, as we discussed in class, we are all able to develop these sort of understanding. So I think what we have to understand is, a lot of times, knowledge is a lot more than formula, facts, and we have to think to ourselves, and we have to be curious about how these theories, how these formula are created, not just taking things from the surface.
Yeah, I can only really add to what everybody has said here. In the scientific world, it's even, I think, to me, more obvious that no, we don't lose our sense of wonder through acquiring knowledge, because, as I said, in the scientific world, it's almost like the more you know and you understand, the more wonders you'll have, the more questions will arise. And I think this is partly why scientists remain in their field of work. It's because day in and day out, they keep thinking of questions they want answered. They make an observation of something and they go, oh, okay, now that I know that, but what about this other thing? What about this next thing? Again, a field in science where there is still a lot unanswered that I know of is obviously neuroscience, in terms of how our brains work. You would think that with the advancement of our physical technology and so on, that we know a lot about how our brains work, but the answer is actually we don't know a lot about how exactly our brains work, which is why it's a fascinating field of science to enter and to study and to do research in, and it has many, many connections with things that people really, really care about, so things like treatment for Alzheimer's disease, treatment for MS, and so on, which we don't have currently a lot of answers for. So, yeah.
I wonder if pursuing, so the idea of acquiring knowledge as a researcher in an institute might actually destroy your sense of wonder if every single day you're having to do something again and again just so that you can get funding or just so that you can stay in this particular institute. And it then becomes monotonous, it becomes drudgery. And that's the same for any field, I'd imagine, where you're just jobbing to try and get the next grant or the next paycheck. I wonder in that very narrow field, not in general, but as an individual within that, when the realities of doing science research might be that you aren't blown away by another set of genes. I don't know. I mean, that would be my question. Does that kind of thing, jobbing scientist, reduce that sense of wonder?
It seems to me like the frustration is not about acquiring knowledge, it's being limited in your acquisition of knowledge, right? They have to do all this red tape and they can't do the thing that they actually care about, which is the acquiring knowledge one. But I'm just speculating.
Yeah, no, I think I would definitely agree that there are certain aspects of that in the world of scientific research. I certainly know of people who've left research for that reason. My undergraduate project was on Drosophila. Biologists in the room might recognize that word. So these are flies, fruit flies. And I do have to say, as much as that I'm very much a lover of science, and I love research in science, but that project in itself was not the most exciting thing that I've done in my life. I killed about 300 flies a day in order to, ethically, but in order to engage in research around the genetics behind some of the, we did crosses and so on with mutant flies, which it sounds very, very exciting, but when you have to do this day in and day out, and actually sometimes the data actually does not present very well because of a technical issue, 20 steps before that step and so on, and it can cause quite a lot of frustration, and some people do give up because of that. Yes.
Yeah, I think there's a danger with this title that you could be too anecdotal. You could just talk about all the wonderful things that there are out there. And I was thinking about Howard Carter when he broke the seal to Tutankhamun's tomb and with torchlight cast the gaze in there and was asked, "What do you see?" And he replied, "I see many wondrous things." So that whether it's in history or whether it's in the arts or in mathematics, the idea of breaking through to acquire new knowledge and push the envelope forward, it would be a wondrous thing, but I think you made a very good case of actually what knowledge looks like for it to be rigorous is based upon like hard work and dedication and testing and retesting. I'm going to just maybe cast up some names like maybe David Attenborough, Jane Goodall. You can see their bright-eyed enthusiasm with their subject has continued into their 9th decade. Brian Cox has a brilliant series called Universe, and he's boyish schoolboy excitement, where you're really wide-eyed when he's seeing like a feather and a cannonball. Really, they drop at the same rate in a vacuum-sealed space. Elon Musk, giggling like a schoolboy when he sees his 2 rockets return. It's really like sci-fi made real. When those rockets return, they land vertically with the afterburners. There's something there. I'm going to refer to the arts, I suppose. A sense of wonder and destruction. You might think about the 27 Club, people like Janis Joplin, Jimi Hendrix, Kurt Cobain, and others, who destroyed themselves maybe through, was it patterns of addiction or trying to use addictive substances to burst through and seek a state of transcendence or escape the pain and suffering of the human condition. There's someone you could look at, like Shane MacGowan, his bandmate in the radio interview. Shane MacGowan was the leader of the Pogues, a brilliant Irish post-punk group that emerged out of London in the late 1980s. And his bandmate said that Shane MacGowan was someone who was wrecked with addiction, but he was a brilliant songwriter and wrote really insightful things about the fragility of how we are. And he said it's like Shane MacGowan bears the weight of the cosmos on his shoulders so that we don't have to. But these people destroy themselves early. His friend and musical counterpart of the time, Nick Cave or David Bowie, could be artists who you could look at who kept on that sense of wonder and exploring and reinventing themselves across a lifetime. And I think for this question, I'd really encourage people to watch Stephen Fry reading Nick Cave's letter about the dangers of AI to the creative process. It's a really, really powerful advocation for retaining our sense of humanity. Are there any other final thoughts about this question? Then I think we're done. Thank you very much indeed for taking part, and thank you for being a good audience.